In 1929, a German excavation team digging through the ruins of an ancient Sumerian temple in southern Iraq uncovered something they were never meant to find. It was a small clay tablet, no larger than a man's hand, fired and sealed inside a cylindrical case marked with 7 distinct cuneiform symbols. The lead archaeologist on the dig refused to allow it to be photographed. Within 48 hours, it was crated, shipped, and moved into a private collection in Berlin, where it would remain hidden for the next 60 years. When the tablet finally surfaced again in the early 1990s, a small group of independent linguists managed to translate roughly 70% of its surface text before access was once again restricted. What they found has been debated, dismissed, mocked, and reburied, but the people who actually read those lines have never been the same. The tablet describes a species, not gods, not demons. A species that walks among humans, eats with humans, sleeps beside humans, and is in nearly every measurable way indistinguishable from us. The Sumerians had a name for them. They had a method for spotting them. And according to the inscription, there is exactly one trait the imitation cannot fake. One physical tell that gives them away every single time. We are going to walk through what the tablet actually says, what the trait is, and why several governments have spent decades pretending this object does not exist. The Sumerians built the first true civilization. Before them, there was no written law, no formal mathematics, no astronomy worth the name, no bureaucracy, no cities holding more than a few thousand people. Then around 4000 BC, in a strip of land between the Tigris and Euphrates, they appeared with all of it already in place. They had a writing system, a calendar based on the precise movement of celestial bodies, a legal code, irrigation engineering, the wheel, the arch, and a working model of the solar system that included planets we did not officially rediscover until the 19th century. They claimed none of it was theirs. Tablet after tablet insists that everything they knew had been given to them by beings who came down from the sky. They called these beings the Anunnaki. The word translates roughly as those who came from the heavens to the earth. In the standard Sumerian account, the Anunnaki did not just visit. They settled, they mined, they ruled, and they made things. Some of what they made was useful, things like tools and cities and crops. Some of it was sacred, temples and ritual systems that lasted thousands of years. But buried inside a small number of tablets, including the one we are discussing tonight, there are references to another category of creation entirely: hybrids, constructs. Beings made to walk among humans for purposes the tablets describe as observation, sorting, and correction. The tablet recovered in 1929 belongs to this last category. It is in plain language, a manual, a field guide for recognizing one of those creations when you encounter it. The species itself is given a name on line 3 of the obverse face. The phonetic reconstruction is uncertain, but the closest reading is Edimu Lugala. The first half means those without spirit. The second is the verb form for they sit among. Together it reads as something close to the spiritless ones who sit among us. That is not poetry. The Sumerians did not write poetry into administrative tablets. The phrase is a technical designation, like a modern field report labeling a specimen. According to the text, they look exactly like us. Not similar, not close, exact. The tablet specifies that they possess what it calls the outer shape, the gait, the voice, the laughter, the sleep, and what the writer calls the small motions of the face. They eat, they drink, they marry, they have children, although the tablet notes that the children produced are themselves of the same kind. There is no diluting it through generations. The line, once introduced into a family, continues. What they cannot do, according to the inscription, is generate the inner heat of feeling. The Sumerians had a specific term for this. They called it the gish, or the inward fire. It was understood as the involuntary physical response of the body to genuine emotion, the racing heart at sudden fear, the flushed face at shame, the held breath at awe. The mimic, the tablet says, can perform all of these. It can produce the racing heart by exertion, or flush its face by holding its breath. But it cannot do it involuntarily. The response is always engineered, always slightly late, always slightly off. And there is one specific manifestation of the inward fire that the mimic, for reasons the tablet does not explain, simply cannot reproduce at all. The tablet is divided into 3 sections. The first describes the origin of the mimic species. The second lists the 7 warning signs. The third describes the test. We have already touched on the first warning. The remaining 6 are progressively harder to detect. According to the origin section, the mimic was not born. It was made. The text uses a specific verb that scholars have rendered as shaped from the wet earth and the breath of the high ones. This is the same phrasing used in other Sumerian tablets to describe the original creation of human beings, suggesting that whoever wrote this text believed the mimics and humans came from the same hands. The difference, the tablet says, lies in what was withheld during the shaping. Humans were given the inward fire. The mimics were not. Everything else was matched precisely so that no observer could tell the difference at first glance. The tablet attributes this to a deliberate choice by the High Ones. The mimics were designed to live among us in order to perform a function. The function is described in only one line of cuneiform, and it is the single most translated and retranslated sentence on the entire object. The closest English rendering reads, "They are placed among the speakers, so that the speakers may be counted, and when the count is reached, the count is delivered." That sentence has been interpreted in at least 4 different ways by the linguists who have studied it. The most literal interpretation is administrative. The mimics are a census mechanism, planted among human populations to track numbers and report them back to the entities that made them. Under this reading, they are not malicious. They are bureaucratic. They are simply collecting data. A second interpretation is darker. Under this reading, the count is delivered refers to a culling event. The mimics are present to monitor human populations until a certain threshold is reached, at which point a correction is triggered. The Sumerians had words for both natural disasters and engineered ones, and the verb used in this sentence belongs to the second category. It is the same word used elsewhere in Sumerian literature to describe the flood. A third interpretation, favored by a small number of linguists, holds that the count is not a population number but a moral one. The mimics are tracking some quality of the human race that the Anunnaki considered important. When that quality reaches a certain level, either too high or too low, the correction begins. The fourth interpretation is rejected by mainstream academics and held quietly by the rest. It reads the sentence as describing a continuous extraction. The mimics are present not to count and report but to harvest. The thing being harvested is the very thing the mimics themselves lack, the inward fire. That fourth reading is the reason this tablet has not been allowed into a museum collection in over 30 years. What makes the fourth reading so difficult to set aside is that the verb used in that sentence appears only one other time in the entire surviving Sumerian corpus. It appears in a separate tablet, recovered from the same temple complex, in a fragmentary passage describing what the Anunnaki took with them when they left. The passage is broken in several places, but the word for what they were extracting and the word for what the mimics are extracting are identical. Whatever the mimics are placed among us to harvest, the same substance was apparently taken away in measurable quantities by the High Ones themselves. The Sumerians believed and recorded plainly that the inward fire of human beings was a resource that was being collected. The mechanism of collection is not described anywhere on the tablet. The text only specifies that it happens slowly, across the host's lifetime, and that the host never notices. The 7 warning signs listed on the tablet are written in descending order of reliability. The first is the most reliable. The 7th is the most subtle. We are not going to be able to cover all 7 here in the depth they deserve, but we will walk through the structure. The first warning is the one we have already discussed: the absence of involuntary emotional response. The tablet warns that this is best observed during moments of sudden surprise, deep grief, or unexpected joy. The mimic will react with the correct facial expression and the correct sound, but the body will not commit, the hands will not tremble, the breath will not catch, the throat will not close. The second warning concerns sleep. According to the tablet, the mimic sleeps, but the sleep is not the same. A human, when deeply asleep, produces small, involuntary movements. The eye flickers under the lid during dreaming, the fingers twitch, the jaw shifts. The mimic, the tablet says, lies perfectly still. The chest rises and falls on a fixed rhythm that does not vary. The eyes do not move. There is no dreaming. because there is nothing to dream with. The third warning involves the response to running water. This one is harder to summarize, because the Sumerian text references a ritual that has not survived. But the substance of it is that the mimic, when forced to cross a fast-moving stream barefoot, will hesitate in a way a human will not. The tablet attributes this to a feature of how the mimic was constructed rather than to any superstition. Modern translators have argued about whether this is physiological or psychological. The fourth warning concerns the response to certain frequencies of sound. The Sumerians had instruments calibrated to specific pitches, and the tablet specifies that one of these pitches, when sounded near a mimic, will produce a measurable physical reaction. What the reaction is, the text does not say. Only that it is reliable, that it cannot be hidden, and that the pitch was kept secret by a lineage of priests who passed it down by mouth only. The fifth warning relates to scent. The text is specific. The mimic does not carry the scent of recent fear, recent illness, or recent grief on its body the way a human does. A human carries these in the sweat and the breath for hours after the event. The mimic does not. To a trained observer, this absence is itself a presence. The sixth warning is the most disturbing of the seven and the one that has caused the most academic discomfort. It concerns the children of mimics. According to the tablet, the offspring of a mimic, even when one parent is human, will display every one of the warning signs from birth. There is no inheritance from the human side. The trait is dominant in a way no natural biology would allow. That brings us to the seventh warning, the one the tablet calls the surest test. The one that no mimic, regardless of how well it has learned to imitate the others, has ever been able to overcome. The seventh warning, the one the Sumerians considered absolute, the one that no mimic in the entire history of the inscriptions has ever been recorded as faking, concerns tears. According to the tablet, the mimic cannot weep, not cannot weep convincingly, cannot weep at all. The tear ducts, the lacrimal glands, the entire physical machinery that produces moisture in the human eye during emotional response is missing, or perhaps it is present, but disconnected from whatever internal mechanism triggers it in humans. The result is the same. When pressed, when struck with grief, when forced to face the death of something it claims to love, the mimic will produce every other sign of weeping: the reddened face, the contorted mouth, the shaking shoulders, the sound, but the eyes will remain dry. The Sumerians called this the dry mourning. They considered it the only completely reliable test. Every other warning sign could be argued, dismissed, or explained away by an unusually composed or unusually disciplined person. But a human who could not cry, regardless of circumstance, regardless of how genuine the grief appeared, was understood to be one of them. The tablet includes a practical method for invoking the test. It is not pleasant to describe. The priests responsible for screening the population would arrange for the suspected mimic to be placed in a controlled situation involving the apparent death or grievous injury of someone they claim to love: a child, a spouse, a parent. The exact mechanics are described in a section of the reverse face that has been only partially translated. What the translators agree on is that the test was effective and that it was used regularly. The tablet records that during one such screening, conducted in the reign of a king whose name has been damaged on the surface, but who is believed to be Eannatum of Lagash, around 2500 BC, more than 400 individuals were tested. Of those 400, the tablet records that 23 failed the seventh test, 23 out of 400, roughly 1 in 17. If that proportion held even loosely across the Sumerian population of that era, the implication is that several thousand who appeared to be ordinary human beings, living in the cities, working the trades, raising what looked like their children, were something else entirely. The Sumerians did not consider this a fringe possibility. They considered it a known feature of their world. They built screening procedures around it, trained priests to administer them, and recorded the results in clay so the knowledge would not be lost. What happened to those 23 is described on the reverse face in a passage most translators have refused to render publicly. The tablet uses a word that translates as "delivered back to the makers." The phrase appears nowhere else in the Sumerian record. The dry mourning is not unique to the Sumerian record. Once you know what to look for, The trait appears across the religious and folkloric traditions of nearly every ancient culture that left written records. The Egyptians had a concept they called the shoot, the shadow, listed as one of the 5 components of a complete soul. A person without a true shoot was considered hollow. Texts describing the screening of officials and priests in the Old Kingdom mention a similar test involving the response to bereavement. The candidate was shown the body of someone close to him and observed. The exact criteria are lost, but the parallel is striking. The Akkadians, who inherited and translated much of the Sumerian literature, preserved a version of the mimic warning in a text known as the Era epic. In one passage, the god Era describes a category of beings called the Rabisu, which translates as the lurkers. The Rabisu walk among the people of the cities, eating what they eat, speaking their language, but lacking what the text calls the salt of the eye. Salt of the eye is the Akkadian idiom for tears. The Hebrew tradition preserves a similar concept in some rabbinical commentaries on the early chapters of Genesis. The references are scattered and most are removed from the canonical text, but certain midrashic writings mention beings called the Lilim, descendants of a primordial union between humans and entities, who could not produce tears. The same writings include warnings about how to identify a Lilim by inviting it into a household and observing its behavior at a funeral. Greek mythology includes a related figure in the Empusai, shape-changing creatures sometimes described as servants of Hecate, who could pass for women in nearly every respect but who could not weep. The Greek physician Hippocrates, who is not generally associated with the supernatural, wrote in one of his case studies about a category of patients he could not categorize because they presented every sign of grief except the lacrimal one. He did not explain the observation. He simply recorded it. Norse and Celtic folklore preserve the trait in the legends of the changeling. A changeling, in the original sense of the word, was a being substituted for a human child by entities from another realm. Identification of a changeling was difficult, but one of the methods preserved in the oldest sources involved provoking the child into a state of grief and observing the eyes. A changeling, the lore said, would howl but would not weep. The Hittite civilization, which rose in central Anatolia 1,000 years after the fall of the Sumerian city-states, kept the warning alive in administrative tablets only recently translated in full. The Hittite version refers to the species as the Dushiala, a word that translates as those who wear the face. The procedure for identifying one was nearly identical to the Sumerian. The candidate was placed in a setting of staged loss, and the eyes were observed. The Hittite records include not just the test but the legal consequences of failing it, which were administered by a specialized court outside the normal judicial system. The Persians inherited a version of the same warning. The Avesta, the foundational text of Zoroastrianism, contains a passage describing a category of beings called the Druj. The Druj are typically translated as demons, but older readings describe them more specifically as beings of false form, who walk in human shape, and who are revealed by their inability to participate in the natural mourning of the body. The Zoroastrian funeral rite, in its original form, included an observation period, during which mourners were watched for the precise sign the Sumerians had described. Even in the Far East, where direct contact with Mesopotamia was minimal in deep antiquity, the trait appears. Certain Chinese folk traditions preserved a category of being known as the Bai Mian, the white face, which could pass for human in every respect except for the response to true sorrow. The Bai Mian was said to attend funerals as part of its mimicry, but to leave the gathering early because it could not sustain the appearance of grief. In every single one of these traditions, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, the trait identifying the imitation is the same. The body can be copied. The voice can be copied. The face can be copied. The behavior can be copied. The tears cannot. What modern researchers have asked, and what the academic mainstream refuses to engage with, is whether this consistent global motif is a shared myth, a shared inheritance from an older common source, or a shared observation of something real. The first explanation, that it is myth, has the advantage of conventional safety. It allows the matter to be filed and ignored. But it does not explain why the test described is so specific, so consistent, and so unrelated to any obvious cultural function. Myths usually serve a purpose within their society. They explain natural phenomena, justify social arrangements, or encode practical wisdom. The dry morning test does none of these things. It is a diagnostic procedure for identifying members of a specific population that does not officially exist. The second explanation, that it is inherited from a common source, is what the alternative historians have argued for the last 50 years. Under this model, the original observation was made at some point in deep prehistory, before any of these cultures had separated from a common ancestor. The Sumerians simply recorded what they had been taught. The Egyptians, Akkadians, Hebrews, Greeks, Norse, and Celts preserved fragments of the same teaching. The details survived because the underlying observation, whatever its origin, was considered too important to lose. The third explanation is the one almost nobody is willing to put in print. Under this reading, the trait is being observed independently by each culture because the population being described is still present and still being observed. The mimics did not die out. They continued and bred true. They walk among us now, in every nation, in every city, in every neighborhood. And the reason no one talks about the dry morning test today is not that the test has stopped working. It is that the population of mimics has grown to the point where any serious attempt to apply the test publicly would trigger consequences that are not survivable. The tablet itself, the one recovered in 1929, has been moved at least 4 times since the 1990s. Its current location is not public. The 2 linguists who completed the most detailed translation died within 18 months of each other, both unexpectedly, both at ages where unexpected death is statistically unusual. The photographic record of the surface inscription was last seen in print in a 1994 monograph that has since been pulled from every major university library that previously held it. Used copies that appeared on the secondary market in the early 2000s were purchased by buyers who declined to identify themselves. There is a pattern here. The pattern has not been explained. And the strange pattern continues. What the tablet leaves us with is a question that is uncomfortable in a way that most questions are not. If the species described is real, if it has continued to the present, if it walks among us in numbers that the Sumerian screening rate would suggest, then every person you have ever known might fall into one of 2 categories. And the only way to know which category any given person belongs to is to wait for the moment of true grief and to watch the eyes. That is not advice. That is not a method to be tried. The Sumerians who applied the test did so with the authority of the state and with consequences for those who failed that we no longer permit and would not want to permit. The point is not that you should perform the test. The point is that somewhere in the deep history of our species, someone considered this question important enough to fire it into clay and to seal it inside a temple where it would last for 4,000 years until the right hands found it. They wanted us to know. They did not say what we were supposed to do with the knowing. They only said that we should not forget. And now you know.